"2006, following soon after the release of Chain of Memories, the next numbered entry to the series was unveiled. Kingdom Hearts 2 takes place 1 year after the events in COM, further deepening the story narrative from the first two titles. Similarly to how KH2 was, in many ways, an evolution of many elements from the original game, Yoko Shimomura returns again to compose the entirety of the Kingdom Hearts 2 original soundtrack, developing it with even more care and consistency compared to the previous two games in the series. The level of integration and thought in how she connects themes together reaches new heights, and all this culminates in making the soundtrack of Kingdom Hearts 2 one of the greatest scores in gaming history. At the beginning of the series in Kingdom Hearts 1, Shimomura experimented with having related tracks share musical material, tying together pieces from the introduction to the finale of the game. But there were many tracks that, for one reason or another, she preferred to make independent, and what these pieces represented was often unclear since these were only ever used once. For Chain of Memories, she seemed to have slightly more control over the narrative soundscape, considering that each track in the OST had a much clearer purpose for when it would play, but this came at the cost of a smaller track list and fewer motivic connections between pieces. Kingdom Hearts 2, then, was developed as a marriage of both these frameworks. The tracklist builds upon many of the established motives, while also having very few single-use independent pieces. Everything feels more tightly knit, and because of this, the aural identity of the characters, events, and the game itself is much more solidly grounded. Breaking down the tracklist for KH2, we can identify the field, battle, event, character, and miscellaneous tracks for this game. You'll note that there are very few tracks classified under the miscellaneous category, and that most of these listed here are these single-use musical numbers for Atlantica. For the most part, this classification system has been useful to isolate the unclear tracks from the last two games, but Shimomura's work for KH2 was more compact, and most of the tracks in this game are used and reused appropriately. I've reassessed the miscellaneous tracks traditionally labeled as orphan, and redefined it in my connection diagram to include some of the other interesting themes that are not melodically connected to any others, despite having a unique purpose that allows them to be used multiple times throughout KH2. We'll see those in a minute. Like with the KH1 video, I'll also refrain from identifying motif family connections between tracks that are functionally just special minigame versions of their original counterparts. This includes pieces like Arabian Dream and Arabian Daydream, Bite Bashing and Bite Striking, What Lies Beneath and Beneath the Ground, and the two Bouncerama versions. Many tracks in KH2 also changed classification from previous lists because they're used in this game in different and often more specific ways. For example, originally the track Mickey Mouse Club March was a single-use cutscene track that played when Donald found King Mickey's letter in KH1. In KH2, this is now the field theme for the trio's visit to Disney Castle. New for Atlantica is a unique field theme in KH2 called Isn't It Lovely? This was changed from KH1's instrumental version of Under the Sea, which is now sung in one of the musicals. The track Treasured Memories also changes. It was originally unclear what its purpose was in KH1, playing only for the scene where young Sora and Kairi drew one another on the Secret Place cave wall. But Treasured Memories is clarified by playing in KH2 as an event theme for nearly all the early game flashback scenes where Roxas recalls Sora's memories. Lastly, A Walk in Andante played in KH1 when Donald and Goofy interacted. In KH2 it plays for 3 scenes. First, when Sora, Donald, and Goofy decide to team up again in front of the Twilight Town Station Plaza. Next, when Mickey meets with the trio in Ansem's study. And finally, when Goofy reveals he's alive after being concussed by the falling boulder. I think it's probably more accurate to call A Walkin' on Dante a reunion theme for Donald and Goofy, updating it from what I said in the KH1 video as simply the Donald-Goofy theme. Now, to explain what I mean about Shimomura getting the most mileage out of her tracks in this game, let me point out a few battle themes I thought were especially interesting. KH2 mimics KH1 in many ways when it comes to the implementation of its battle tracks. We'll talk about a few of these later on, but in the same way that KH1 had early game, mid game, and late game boss battle music, KH2 follows this blueprint as well. Dance to the Death seems to be an early game Heartless battle theme for event fights and most sub-bosses. Vim and Vigor and The Encounter both seem to be tracks that play when Sora is fighting or allied with a Disney or Final Fantasy character. Rowdy Rumble is interesting too. It's KH2's gimmick fight battle music, and it plays for events like escorting Queen Minnie to the throne room, as well as the Lock, Shock, Barrel battle in the Toy Factory. More comments about these sorts of tracks and others can be found in the spreadsheet document in the video description. All of the motivic development Shimomura built through the music of KH1 and COM led to the culminating soundtrack of Kingdom Hearts 2. In the subsequent games, the music will continue to build meaningfully, but KH2 represents such a large step in the series' musical mythos that it's impossible to ignore the impact these pieces had in nearly every entry of the Darkseeker saga moving forward. Only by unwrapping the connections present throughout KH2's musical soundscape can we come to more deeply appreciate how Yoko Shimomura's musical narrative complements and enhances Tetsuya Nomura's storytelling. All that said, here is a diagram showing the connections between various pieces in the Kingdom Hearts 2 soundtrack. Before diving deeper into how the tracks in KH2 are related to one another, let me first start by addressing KH2's interesting orphan tracks. The orphan tracks listed here don't share musical material with anything else in the soundtrack, but are included because I wanted to explain the purpose they serve and their role in the game's world building. Like I mentioned, Treasured Memories is clarified from KH1, becoming a track that plays when Sora, or characters related to Sora, recall memories of their past. Due to its single use in KH1, I might have previously assessed this track to be a secondary theme for Kairi, or a track that represented Sora and Kairi's childhood, so I'm glad to have this new understanding from its reuse in KH2. Missing You is interesting, playing for a few scenes. Kairi sending off her message in a bottle, Beast sadly telling Belle to leave his castle, and Simba remembering his father at the Oasis, among others. It seems to represent exactly what its title implies, characters thinking of things they long for, which hadn't needed a musical representation up until this point in the series. In the game, it plays a similar role that the track Friends in My Heart represents, but Missing You is more of a melancholy longing feeling compared to the remembering fondly feeling of the scenes when Friends in My Heart plays. Pulling from a selection of track notes that Shimomura wrote for her Kingdom Hearts 10th Anniversary fan selection album, she commented that in her mind, Missing You is part of a set with Treasured Memories, both of which have to do with recognizing an important treasure. Moving on, the Escapade is a non-battle minigame theme, playing for the Odd Job missions in Twilight Town, as well as the Filling the Presents minigame at Santa's Workshop. Laughter and Merriment is similar to Piccolo Resto from COM. It's used in KH2 as lighthearted background music for non-serious moments, in scenes like when Sora, Donald, and Goofy meet the Gullwings, when Genie returns to Agrabah and confuses Pete for Aladdin, or when Sora meets Santa. The last track we'll talk about here is Apprehension, which is a danger theme, playing when a threat is immediate, such as the Land of Dragons Summit Avalanche, Cub Simba running from the Stampede at the Pride Lands, and Luxor destroying the Interceptor with cannon fire, stranding Sora's party. Now, I also thought it would be useful to list a unique section for what I'll call KH2's evolutionary tracks. This consists of a few pieces in KH2 that get expanded arrangements from their previous versions. Simple, updated versions of older themes with nicer instrumentation, like the KH2 version of Fragments of Sorrow or Kairi's theme, are not included in this group. The new arrangements included here are specific in that they will differ in significant ways to make them unique enough to get a new track title or a unique section. I think this group will be useful so we can track how different pieces, like Hollow Bastion's theme for example, change over the course of the series. Dearly Beloved gets a significant new arrangement for every game starting from KH2 and onward in the chronology, and it's included here. This KH2 arrangement, the first title version with full orchestral treatment, is often cited by fans as being among the best versions of this theme. The tracks Destiny Islands and Hand in Hand are both included here because I consider them significantly different than their previous versions. The Destiny Islands arrangement that plays in the final cutscene is the version from Chain of Memories, but with a new string intro sequence. KH2's Hand in Hand that plays right afterward in the cutscene is similar to its arrangement in the KH1 reprise, but with an additional melody added to the end that I'll talk about in a bit. Returning to Hollow Bastion's theme, it's updated from KH1 with a new intro and different instrumentation. The arrangement for KH2 is titled Reviving Hollow Bastion. These changes may come as less of a surprise considering that the setting is starkly different despite the world being the same. The 13th Struggle is also here because it's updated in the KH2 arrangement to include a new section referencing the organization. We talked about this in the Chain of Memories video, and I'll also mention it again later on. Okay, with these updated groups explained, we can now dive in earnest into the Motif families that Shimomura created or expanded with her music for Kingdom Hearts 2. Roxas' group is very straightforward. His motif plays for the two tracks that represent him, his normal theme and his Final Mix exclusive battle theme, The Other Promise. With Nomura's direction and in her own words, Shimomura wrote The Other Promise to be an expression of the, quote, unbearable sadness of a destiny you can't fight against. There's not a ton of musical insight needed to make the connection between these tracks, but it's important to make note of this group because Roxas gets referenced later in the series. He's also the first character in the series to get a battle version of his theme, but not the last. Of course, we'll talk about other special characters to get battle versions of their themes in future videos. From Roxas to Sora. At last, our protagonist finally gets his own theme. As a matter of fact, the whole Destiny trio is musically completed in KH2. Riku's theme is also revealed later on. I mentioned Sora here specifically because the two elements in his theme that get referenced by other tracks are his triplet intro and his theme's unique rhythmic undercurrent. In KH2, the track Blast Off references a tiny variation of this rhythm. This is the Gummi Ship start music just before entering a mission in the lanes between. The Gummi Ship clear music, crossing the finish line, also references the same rhythm. So interesting that these Gummi themes seem to quote Sora in this way. It comes across through its use in game that Sora's theme consists of his triplet melodic identifier, and this rhythm that seems to signal adventure when referenced. A somewhat surprising disconnect KH2 has compared to KH1 is that many of the Gummi Ship event themes don't share a singular motif like they all did in KH1. You'll recall that the KH1 tracks Blast Away Gummi Ship 1 through 3, Shipmeister's Humoresque, and Precious Stars in the Sky all shared this statement. In KH2, the main Gummi motif is slightly modified. This is shared between KH2's overworld map music, A Twinkle in the Sky, and as a variant in the Gummi editor theme, Shipmeister's Shanty. I couldn't find any links between Shipmeister's Shanty and KH1's Shipmeister's Humoresque, but we can point out that the KH2 track also shares this fun element with the Gummi start theme Blast Off. Surprisingly, these are the only connections I could find in all of KH2's Gummi tracks. Now, in KH2, the track Hesitation plays as a warning theme for recognizing a threat or showing a menacing situation, contrasting with the track Apprehension, which represents an immediate danger. Hesitation plays when the village in Land of Dragons is shown to have been burned down, when Genie Jafar is released from his lamp, and even as Kairi is shown to be imprisoned in a cell by Saïx. Previously, the track Villains of a Sort introduced the Disney villains, and I had linked the calm track Disquieting to it in the Chain of Memories video because they played in exactly the same instances, both with the use of a whole tone scale. Hesitation, being a threat theme, may just have an accidental connection to Disquieting, but both happen to have falling 3-note chromatic movement, enough to make me question if it was an intentional compositional choice to link them together in this way. Chromaticism, like the use of the whole tone, is also a common musical technique to represent instability. You can hear this yourself even with the tracks that use, for example, the chromatically descending secrets motif in the last video. And although the use of this chromaticism here in Kingdom Hearts may not be an intentional connection, I thought it was worthwhile to point out due to how similarly both these tracks seem to represent general antagonism when they're played, respectively. And by the way, Villains of a Sort is used in KH2 just like it always has been, as a Disney villain introduction theme, and mostly for accompanying Maleficent's screen time. It's somewhat rare that a field and battle track in the series share musical material, but just like in the case with the Castle Oblivion field battle pair, the tracks for the Cavern of Remembrance have a small commonality that they share. As Sora traverses through the cavern, he eventually reaches a hallway with a very similar aesthetic to that of the castle, so it seems appropriate that, just like Castle Oblivion and Forgotten Challenge share a phrased shape in the harp, the tracks Cavern of Remembrance and Deep Anxiety share this floaty, metrically free piano element. I also want to add that I used to think for the longest time that this little fill in Cavern of Remembrance is pretty close to Kyrie. But there's no chance this is an intentional reference, tonality differences aside, and I often use this exact example to demonstrate how careful we should be in calling out references as intentional, instead of just chalking them up to being part of Shimomura's compositional style. Just a point to which we should be wary. Nobodies are a new threat in Kingdom Hearts 2, and Shimomura seemed to give these creatures a motif to imply their presence in a few tracks from throughout the game. The track Tension Rising could be called a general Nobody battle theme. It plays for most of the Nobody-influenced events throughout the game, like the Twilight Thorn confrontation in Roxas' Station of Awakening, and most of the relevant Nobody event battles. Pay attention to this track's most defining characteristic, the echoed synth texture, and notice how Shimomura calls back to this theme by making this texture an element in the battle theme for the organization's stronghold in the world that never was. This echoey effect can similarly be subtly heard as part of transitional material between Darkness of the Unknown's first and second movement, but I'll talk more about this soon. In addition to this, there may be another similarity between specifically the rainbow-like arpeggiations used in Deep Drive, A Fight to the Death, The Other Promise, and also Darkness of the Unknown. These are the only tracks in the game that use this musical expression, and they all happen to be used for the final stretch of the game and related to Nobodies. But this specific link just isn't strong enough to justify the relatively rudimentary technique of arpeggiating as a special motif for inclusion in the chart here. I almost think that including these arps in these final tracks only serve to make them musically impressive rather than narratively cohesive, but it's an additional interesting similarity between these pieces to share and think about. Fate of the Unknown is KH2's secret movie track. It plays like Another Side did for KH1's secret cinematic. In the base KH2, the post-credits cutscene was accompanied by the track Sunset Horizons, but upon completing the necessary requirements, KH2 Final Mix treated international audiences with this thunderous piece of music. Fate of the Unknown explicitly foreshadows two themes, just like Another Side foreshadowed Organization 13, But at the time that KH2 would have been released, we wouldn't have known about the 2 tracks that would later develop out of this one. I'll address both in a future video. What we might be able to say is that at the beginning of Fate of the Unknown, we can listen carefully to the choir and note that a similar fragment of the same thirds voiced movement is used very subtly in the background strings for Rage Awakened, the secret boss battle music against the Lingering Will. Shimomura likes to use 3-3-2 dotted rhythmic patterns in her music, but both Fate of the Unknown and Rage Awakened are heavily comprised of these rhythms in a way that kind of dominates the climaxes of both pieces. Normally, I'd chalk this up to Shimomura's well-known love of Latin music and rhythm, and call it part of her compositional style, but it's possible that this could be something more substantial. Could this be another link to further connect Rage Awakened with Fate of the Unknown? I can leave you with these short comparative transcriptions of the high points from both for you to make your own judgments. Shimomura herself stated that she usually doesn't know the identity of the secret bosses she composes for, and was happy that Rage Awakened ultimately was compatible with Lingering Will's identity that gets revealed in a later game. So maybe we shouldn't look too deeply into these connections, but even still, there might be something here worth exploring. The previous few motif families we just talked about generally weren't drastically important for supplementing the plot narrative in KH2, but it was interesting to take note of the tracks that Shimomura seemed to connect together, and a few of those families, particularly the character themes, will be revisited as future games continue to weave connections from those tracks. Now I'd like to take you through some of the larger and more important groups in KH2. It may be unsurprising that the Dearly Beloved family is populated with familiar themes from the previous few games. Some examples here, like Friends in My Heart, we've already talked about. This is a track that plays for, fittingly, remembering friends, and it plays like when Sora says goodbye to the Twilight Town gang and boards the train to Yensid's mysterious tower, or when Sora is reunited with an Ansem-like figure and realizes it's actually Riku. KH2's Dearly Beloved incorporates Always on My Mind from KH1, similar to the Chain of Memories arrangement. Always on My Mind serves a role by playing in both the title version as well as the reprise to remind the player of the journey Sora's taken to bring his friends back together. At the very end of the game, in the post-credits cutscene when Kairi hands Sora a mysterious letter, Hand in Hand returns as a send-off just like it appeared for the KH1 and Chain of Memories ending scenes. In the KH2 reprise of this melody, the end of the track newly references Dearly Beloved. As for the new tracks in the family, what may be a surprising connection is the Gummi track Asteroid Attack. This is a track that plays for the 2 sweep Gummi Ship routes, the ones heading toward Land of Dragons and Beast Castle respectively, and also the only Gummi Ship route music that references Dearly Beloved. This will be the track the player hears on whichever the first 2 routes they choose to embark on, and I think it's incorporated to provide some comfort while introducing the new Gummi mechanics. Shimomura has stated before that Dearly Beloved usually represents someone precious to you, and precious memories in general. In this case, I think the precious memories of playing through KH1's Gummi Ship were intended for the player. Lastly, the track A Fight to the Death also references Dearly Beloved, but offset, again providing a source of light and reassurance during one of the most chaotic battle sequences in the game. The track plays for the entire second phase battle against the infiltration and assault of Xemnas' War Machine Dragon. Moving from light to darkness, Destati also has several interesting appearances throughout KH2, some of which may be more overt than others. A familiar track, Fragments of Sorrow, is used in KH2 for Roxas' Station of Awakening battle theme, in the same way it was used for Sora's station. This track is essentially a battle version of Destati, containing all three of the commonly quoted elements we are already familiar with. Strange Whispers returns from KH1 as well, and if you'll recall, it contains the 3-note darkness motif that was developed out of Destati. This track plays in one scene, and up until this point, Roxas had been regaining memories with the track Treasured Memories playing, but Strange Whispers accompanies the final Roxas dream of Sora walking toward Castle Oblivion. Tonally, it makes more sense for this track to play here than all the other flashback scenes, but I might have expected something like Disquieting from Calm instead, since Strange Whispers has been traditionally associated with Robed Ansem. Moving on though, Kaoru Wada orchestrated the single-use cutscene track that plays as Sora, Donald, and Goofy charge into the Battle of 1,000 Heartless. Showdown at Hollow Bastion quotes the main Destati ascending ostinato as part of Another Side. Showdown also plays the primary identifying melody unique to Another Side, with additional horn accompaniment. Darkness of the Unknown also clearly quotes the darkness motif in Destati, but we'll talk more about that special track in depth momentarily. Aside from that, other instances of the 3-note darkness motif I heard in tracks like Tension Rising, Sunset Horizons, Showdown at Hollow Bastion, and even Fate of the Unknown, are almost certainly coincidental since the phrases continue in non-Destati ways, and I would have to break them. Similarly, and to be transparent in how I've categorized these tracks in the past, I've also removed the track Disappeared from this family, since the darkness motif I heard in it for the KH1 video also continues with non-Destati material and makes me further question how related it actually is. So ultimately, that's why I've decided not to include any of these in this family. For Riku's theme specifically, it also quotes the darkness motif as practically a foundational element. It continues with non-Destati material, but it may be less of a stretch to suggest that this motif's use incorporated into the undercurrent of his theme musically shows how he's grown from KH1 and from Darkness itself with its repeated use. So I've added him here to the chart for you to consider. By far the most complex group of tracks Shimomura created for KH2 were those associated with Organization 13. We can see that the family has grown quite large since its inception from the tracks in Chain of Memories. Shimomura even going as far as stating that the track Organization 13 has become prolific enough to even rival Dearly Beloved in terms of usefulness. Each of the 3 organization battle themes that play in KH2 borrow a motif developed from part of the founding track Organization 13, which was splintered off the KH1 track Another Side. The most obvious referential material would be the 5-note Org 13 motif. We can hear this in KH2's version of The 13th Struggle, which plays when Sora fights an organization member alone, without allies. The 13th Dilemma references the middle part of Organization 13, and plays when battling an organization member with allies. Additionally, the 13th dilemma also references the climax of Another Side. The 13th Reflection is a Final Mix exclusive track that plays for the absent silhouette battles, as well as the new data organization fights in the Garden of Assemblage. It references the falling piano intervals from Organization 13, as well as the main 5-note Org 13 motif. Now, I want to pose a question regarding Deep Drive. As the battle music to an original KH world, we might expect to find connections to the field theme. When listening to Deep Drive, I really scoured the track for small musical elements Shimomura may have shared with the field theme, Sacred Moon, or other tracks in KH2, and I think I found an inconspicuous one to finish this family. Deep Drive sounds to me like the first part focuses in on a C Phrygian melody, like Sacred Moon, despite the two not sharing any overt musical material. That said, there may be a small nod to the main Organization 13 motif in Phrygian and a little mixed up just before the chorus in Deep Drive. It sounds very similar in contour, doesn't it? So I made a link here with Org 13 because this phrase that just keeps showing up in the track seems like an appropriate and intentional, albeit distinct, modification of Org 13. If this connection is intentional, what an incredible way to combine links to Nobodies and the organization as Sora approaches and battles through the castle. Sacred Moon, which is the field theme to the organization's headquarters at the World That Never Was, is developed out of the choir section of the 13th Struggle, which again was the first theme that ever played in the series to introduce the organization back in Chain of Memories. Actually, Xemnas' theme, Disappeared, might have been the first reference for the origins of Sacred Moon. You can hear that the choir in Disappeared seems to sing a variation of what we now know as the Sacred Moon melody. Listen closely. It's unclear if this element from Disappeared was later ported into the 13th Struggle, which was then later used to compose Sacred Moon, but it would certainly be fitting if the Organization 13 leader's theme actually referenced the world he presides over. Or maybe it's the other way around. We've now addressed most of the motif families Shimomura linked together in Kingdom Hearts 2, and let's finish by talking about two huge pieces that conclude the game. Although it is thematically inconsequential to KH2's plot, Fantasia alla Marcia for piano, chorus, and orchestra, which was orchestrated by Karawada, serves as the credits medley. It's much more extensive than the credits track from KH1. This is because the KH1 March Caprice only contained a reference to Dearly Beloved, along with its original material. Whereas KH2's Fantasia is a march finale that references a ton of themes throughout its 7-minute runtime. Beginning with introductory original material, it then pivots to Sora's theme. Following this, it returns with more original material, for laying down statements of Dearly Beloved, this time the Always on My Mind segment, Destati, Another Side, and Organization 13, one more reprise of Dearly Beloved and Always on My Mind, and finishing with more original material. It's a little too long to play in its entirety here, but it's an extremely impressive medley of strong themes Shimomura wanted the player to remember from this game and on into the future of the series. Finally, we can end this presentation by discussing an absolutely monumental theme from Kingdom Hearts 2, the final battle track, Darkness of the Unknown. It's made up of tons of original material, while simultaneously being unbelievably cross-referential to many organization-related motives, acting as a true culmination of the organization's struggle to achieve personhood and the ultimate showdown against Xemnas, the organization's leader. Darkness of the Unknown is made up of 3 movements for each of the remaining 3 phases of Xemnas' battle. The first reference comes in right at the start of the second movement, and it's a doozy. Some backstory is required here. The Phase 2 fight against Xemnas' Dragon Machine plays a fight to the death. The chord progression during the piano arpeggiations in this track are notably similar to the undercurrent of organ during this part of Darkness of the Unknown. We can see the constant use of diminished chords returning to tonic in a way that no other tracks have done up to this point. In addition, remember the track Tension Rising, which is a lesser Nobody battle theme? This is the first track in the game that incorporates that echoey synth texture throughout. This is later referenced again by the battle theme in The World That Never Was called Deep Drive. Now arriving at this battle against the leader of the Nobodies, we can not only hear a similar chord progression from A Fight to the Death, but also the organ mimics what seems to be this Nobody texture that's only ever used in the Nobody battle themes. This whole transitional sequence, combining the 2 elements from these previous tracks, is used merely as an introduction to the second movement of Xemnas' battle theme, as a mixture of the piano arpeggiations from A Fight to the Death, and the echoes representing the Nobody underlings he rules over. It's a stunning use of 2 incredibly storied elements that seemingly aren't even the musical focus leading to the next part of the track. Right after this, Movement 2 begins, and an ostinato is introduced in accordion that will play throughout most of this section. This ostinato is actually developed out of repurposing the melody and bass line from the 13th Struggle. It really seems like many elements from the 13th Struggle were developed into most of the tracks for the organization throughout this series, in both Chain of Memories, as well as all these examples we've talked about throughout Kingdom Hearts 2. We can also hear several variant statements of the Organization 13 motif in piano many times throughout both the second and third movements. Of course, Destati also appears very evidently in Darkness of the Unknown. It's sung by solo violin in Movement 3, just before the riff from the start of the track is reintroduced. In addition, we can also clearly hear the Ansem motif from Disappeared, and also Forze da Male, showing up to remind the player the identity of the enemy before them. only is Darkness of the Unknown musically a triumphant finisher, but all these ties to various organization-related pieces from throughout the game narratively push it into a category of its own in terms of sheer impact, presence, and significance for this conclusion to the current trilogy. This is nearly everything that makes up this track, but also possibly hidden in the iconic original melody of Darkness of the Unknown may be another piece. Remember what I said earlier when talking about Fate of the Unknown and Rage Awakened, and how Shimomura seemed to use a lot of 3-3-2 patterns for that event? The same may also be true with this Darkness of the Unknown melody, but as for what that means, we'll have to save that talk for a future video as to how this possible, and admittedly probably coincidental, secret reference may or may not be incredible foreshadowing. So many themes in Kingdom Hearts are cross-referential that it can be difficult to separate these groups to pick apart what Shimomura may have been thinking when creating the music. KH2 is a shining example of a game soundtrack that's intricately connected in a way that helps to clarify and deepen the impact of on-screen events, as well as foreshadow story threads that will appear later on. In Kingdom Hearts 2, there's a great emphasis put toward hinting at the organization's machinations by bridging together many different pieces in an effort to get the player to think about how the organization's influence has affected events throughout the story. Shimomura also makes a point to incorporate many references back to the series' foundation in tracks that quote Dearly Beloved and Destati in various ways. Because of this, the soundtrack to Kingdom Hearts 2, with all these connections so far, feels like it's grown with Sora, and that the music is telling a story equally as profound as the plot of the games. In the next video, we'll explore the music from 358 Days Over 2, a story that takes place concurrently with Chain of Memories, and revolves around Roxas' time in the organization. This title, and the music introduced in it, explains more about the motivations of the Nobodies, and how the tragedy of Roxas ultimately led to the downfall of Organization 13.